Alrighty, I want to start this video off by expressing that this video is not an exhaustive academic study. Rather, it is a passage that challenged the way I think about sin and grace, which I touched in on a Bible study that I did at my school. With that being said, let's get into it. So the main question of this video, my main thesis statement, is if the wages of sin is death, why does John later say that some said sin is not deadly? And honestly, that's what confused me at first. During the Bible study, whenever I first heard this passage, I was connecting ideas here. Is the statement that is said in Romans, for the wages of sin is death, not as applicable here. They seem to not have as much alignment as I thought it would have. And so going into 1 John, we first have to examine the fact that this writing may or may not have been written by John. It's more that we claim the author to be John, and only because we have seen that his writings are very similar to the other author of John. And for the sake of this video, I'm just going to call him John, whether or not we know his real name. Continuing. If I didn't make it clear in the beginning of the video, this is a direct examination of the passage in 1 John chapter 5, specifically the verses 14 through 17. So I'm going to go line by line describing what each one means, and just to clarify what I'm talking about whenever I'm getting this misconception in my head. And this is the boldness we have in him, that if we ask anything according to his will, he will hear us. This is declaring confidence before God, that trusting in God will give us confidence. And then it says in verse 15, and if we know that he hears us in whatever we ask, we know that we have obtained the requests of him through prayer and through trusting in God. If you see your brother or sister committing what is not a deadly sin, you will ask, and God will give life to such a one. To those whose sin is not deadly, there is sin that is deadly. I do not say to you that you should pray about that. Two things. Saying that praying for a brother or sister who does sin is what we are called to do. That what he's making here, the claim he's making, is that we should pray for one another if they're in the faith, if they value the importance of sin. And here's this distinction, is there's a difference between a deadly and non-deadly sin, which confused me, because in Romans, whenever it says for the wages of sin is death, that seems to be awkwardly worded. So I continue. In verse 17 it says, all wrongdoing is sin, but there is sin that is not deadly. Something to clarify here. All wrongdoing is sin. At least as a Christian, I believe that anything that disobeys the law of Moses, which there are some little things that I may not follow, but ultimately choose to do my best to follow because of grace. That there should be an emphasis on grace if you have committed a sin, which that's kind of hard to get here. It says all wrongdoing is sin, but there is sin that is not deadly. But the wages of sin is death. So some interpretations to look at this passage whenever going into reading 1 John 5 is the idea of the greatest, most deadly sin is the final rejection of Christ. That we should not pray for those who have finally rejected Christ because they have ultimately decided that they're not to be faithful to Christ. And so that final rejection of Christ can lead to apostasy, the abandoning of a religious faith, and that is almost a main point that many people may agree with there. That is an interpretation. And another one may be blasphemy against the Holy Spirit, which I will say the Holy Spirit is not directly spoken here about, but one can see it that way. And then the final interpretation is physical death as divine judgment, that the actual dying is the final judgment that God has for us, and that past that, God has greater things for us. Or if one does not believe in God, that judgment is death, and that we shall be separated from God forever. So, but what's the main focus? The main thing to take away here is that John is not explicitly categorizing sin. In fact, these interpretations are narratives that fit the doctrine that one believes in whatever denomination you call yourself to be a part. But it is saying that he is calling us to pray for sinners, trust God's mercy, and do not fall into despair. That claiming that that is not his point. His point is that we should be praying for others, and that there should be more of an emphasis on that. But what is my application? How can one take away from this passage? I believe that this passage is interpreted in this very legalistic way. One can feel that all sin is something they should feel guilty about. This is what one would call Christian legalism, that salvation follows through faith in rules and laws rather than adhering to God's grace, which is not exactly the most healthy way to deal with how God's governance works. Ultimately, Christ died for us so that we may have grace, and that is almost certainly the point of this passage, that there should be an emphasis on grace rather than just guilt on sin. An overemphasis on minimizing sin creates an early form of Christian legalism. Yet in comparison, an overemphasis on grace can develop complacency. Neither extreme can work. I myself have experienced this through believing that I can almost fix myself through being perfect, that if I choose not to sin as much, my life may be better, which we're not really deciders of our life. There's very little things that we can control. And ultimately, it's accepting that grace and sin almost have to coexist, that the Lord provides us grace so that that sin is a little less of an impact on our lives, so that we may have less guilt. Here's the greater tension, though. Romans says that the wages of sin is death. First John distinguishes between sin leading to death and sin not leading to death. Christians interpret this differently. How should one deal with this tension, and what should they do with that? I mean, ultimately, it is the decision in your brain about what you're going to believe in. But one way that can be a proactive way of looking at this is going to a pastor, a priest, someone who actually knows what they're talking about, a theologian, and asking this question to them. And ultimately, through their advice, deciding what you see in this passage. It's not a make it or break it thing in the religion, but it's certainly important. Everything in any text is important. What I simply mean is, whatever John means by sin leading to death, he clearly doesn't want believers trapped in despair. He distinguishes between all wrongdoing and sin that leads to death, while repeatedly directing Christians towards confidence in God and prayer for another. The harder question is what we do with that distinction. My encouragement is not to reject authority or tradition, but to engage with them honestly enough that your own convictions come one's own. Anyways, that's going to wrap up my video for today. I hope you all enjoyed. I'm going to continue making more videos like this, and I have the summer now to spend time researching a little bit about these things, so I can, better myself through knowledge while also enjoying my summer vacation. Anyways, thank y'all, and have a great day.